Jace had never set foot on a space station before Elion 6, and within 2 hours of arriving, he'd already seen 6 species he didn't have names for, been nearly trampled by a sprinting Centauran herd student, and misidentified a decorative fountain as a hydration station. It tasted like fish oil and metal polish. So, when the 10-foot Craelian professor at the front of the auditorium rumbled, "Tomorrow, we begin swordsmanship training," Jace felt a flicker of relief. Finally, something that made sense. He could still hear his uncle's voice in the back of his mind, scratchy and serious. "There's no such thing as fake swordsmanship, kid. If you're not ready to bleed for it, you're not training, you're dancing." For 6 years since he was 12, Jace had been shaped by that philosophy. His father taught him form, his uncle taught him pain. 3 years ago, they switched to real blades, no dulled edges. No safe words. Just control, precision, and discipline beaten into him on cold earth mornings. So when Professor Vokthar mentioned swordsmanship, Jace assumed the academy finally meant business. He didn't know the rest of the class would be showing up with padded carbon sabers and impact reduction gloves. That night, Jace sat on the lower bunk in his dorm, slowly unwrapping the oilcloth bundle from the bottom of his trunk. Inside was his uncle's sword, long, weathered, real steel, and still nicked from the last time they'd sparred before he left Earth. Jace held it across his knees for a long time. Then he began to polish it, just as he'd been taught. Tomorrow, he would step into something familiar, something honest. He had no idea he was about to cause a minor diplomatic incident. The Academy's dueling room was more of a small stadium, elliptical and tiered, with polished synthwood flooring and adjustable grav dampeners. Cadets filed in, laughing and jostling, slipping into regulation gear from the racks. Carbon alloy sabers, magnetized training gloves, body braces with shock dispersal linings. Jace walked in last, carrying a long cloth bundle slung across his back and no gear at all. He was halfway to the sparring floor before anyone really noticed. A drellery student, lizard-like, cerulean and sharp-toothed, snorted. "What's that, a spear?" "No, I think it's a flute," someone else quipped. Jace said nothing. He knelt on the outer edge of the arena and began to unwrap the canvas. By the time he'd folded it back and the steel glinted under the overhead lights, the room had gone very quiet. The longsword was slightly curved, its pommel wrapped in leather so worn it looked part of the blade. The edge caught the light in a dull sheen, not reflective, but polished with intent. Along the spine, shallow notches spoke of old deflections. Near the hilt, faint letters were carved into the metal, "Forged through." Professor Vokthar approached on heavy, deliberate steps. He loomed at full height, casting a long shadow that nearly reached Jace's knees. His lower brow plates tightened. "That is not an Academy-issued weapon," he said, voice like sand through iron. Jace stood, sword resting loosely in his hand. "It's not. It's my uncle's. I brought it from Earth." Vokthar's upper lids narrowed. "We do not use lethal weapons in training here, cadet." Jace nodded. "I understand, but I was taught swordsmanship doesn't mean anything if it's safe. It's not meant to injure, just to be real." A low mutter passed through the surrounding cadets. A few had stopped strapping in their sabers. Vokthar looked at the blade, then at Jace, then exhaled heavily. "You may not use that weapon in a spar. It is an unacceptable hazard." Jace hesitated. "I was told there are cultural exemptions." That brought another ripple through the room. Vokthar didn't blink, but one of his brow plates twitched. "You claim this as cultural practice?" "Yes. I was raised with it, trained under it. It's not a weapon to me, it's a discipline." The pause that followed lasted far too long for Jace's liking. Finally, the Craelian grunted. "One bout. Cultural demonstration only. I will supervise. You will be matched with an appropriate opponent." The words were barely out before someone barked from the side. "I'll take it." Rezik stepped forward, grinning, already bouncing on his 3 heels. The Gornii was stocky, fast, and loud, with mottled skin that shifted color depending on his mood, currently a confident, challenging orange. He rotated his third arm lazily, the other 2 holding his saber with ease. "Let's see how antique steel stacks up against real form," Rezik said, winking at his cluster of friends behind him. Jace didn't respond. He stepped into the center circle, sword resting at his side, and took his stance, left foot forward, knees slightly bent, blade held low and angled. Not like the upright balanced stances everyone else used, this one looked primitive. Rezik circled him. "That's your stance? Looks like you're waiting to fall over. Still, Jace said nothing. Vokthar lifted one massive hand. Begin. Rezik darted in first, fast and flashy, just like the record said. His saber swept from overhead with a snap that should have forced Jace back, but the longsword pivoted up, caught the arc near its peak, and redirected it with a clang that echoed across the chamber. Rezik blinked, adjusted. This time, he came low, left arm feinting, saber arm swinging wide. Jace twisted his torso, stepped inside, and used the longsword's crossguard to trap the incoming saber. Then came the break. A pivot of Jace's hips, a firm push with his offhand at the blade's flat, and the carbon alloy saber twisted under the pressure. The weapon's emitter sparked once, then snapped at the base. Rezik had half a second to register that his weapon was gone before Jace's foot swept his legs. The Gornii hit the floor hard. Something cracked. He groaned loudly and rolled, clutching his shoulder with all three hands. One of them trembled. Jace backed away immediately, sword down, eyes wide. I didn't mean, he started. Vokthar was already moving. Medical to Arena 2, now. A thin-faced Asheri medic appeared within seconds, calling out instructions. Two assistants gently braced Rezik and slid a diagnostic band over his shoulder. Jace stood rooted to the spot, guilt swimming in his stomach. Anterior dislocation, the medic said. No fractures. He'll need stabilization and imaging. 4 weeks minimum for recovery, maybe 6 with therapy. Jace stepped forward. Can I help? The medic eyed him. You can help by staying out of the way. But Rezik, pale now and clearly in pain, groaned through gritted teeth. Let him walk me down. 's fine. Vokthar stared at Jace, unreadable. This incident will be formally reviewed. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all physical training courses. Until then, report to Medbay each morning at second bell. Understood? Jace nodded. Yes, sir. He turned and followed the medics out, the longsword still in his hand. As he passed the edge of the arena, he knelt and began wrapping it back into the canvas slowly, carefully, like a ritual. Behind him, the cadets whispered, some in awe, some in worry. The sword was real. So was the consequence. Jace showed up to the medbay at second bell, as ordered. The corridors of the north wing were quiet at that hour, filled only with the soft hum of cleaning drones and the distant murmur of overlapping species languages from the upper lounges. The scent of antiseptic cleanser hit him the moment the sliding door hissed open. Sterile, cold, familiar in its own way. A wiry woman with bright green eyes and cropped white blonde hair looked up from a terminal. Her badge read, Supervisor Linnea Carver. You're the sword kid, she said without glancing at the registry. You broke Rezik. Jace stiffened. I didn't mean to. It wasn't. I read the report. He volunteered. Still broke. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You know how many cadets dislocate something in a duel? He shook his head. Not many. Usually the Sabers lose first. She let the moment hang, then waved toward a sanitation sink. Scrub in. You'll be on tissue retrieval and supply handoff. No touching patients, no administering meds. You're not a medic. Not yet. Jace scrubbed in. For the first week, he hardly spoke. He followed instructions, handed over instruments, restocked medi patches, and tissue stabilizers. There were all sorts of injuries at the academy, even without real weapons, strained cartilage from acrobatics training, punctured membranes from species with less than durable skin, and, in one case, a pair of intertwined Veltiri students who had somehow chemically bonded during a trust fall. Jace didn't ask questions. He was there to learn, to serve, and to make up for what he'd done. But the medbay staff noticed he didn't flinch at the sight of an open wound, or pale at the bone scanner's low buzz. When one of the Ashkari interns fainted mid-procedure after a cadet regurgitated its secondary stomach, it was Jace who helped steady the patient. It didn't go unnoticed. By the 10th day, Linnea handed him a data slate with new clearance. You're approved for supervised intake assessments. No invasive procedures. Just vitals, range of motion, observation notes. Jace blinked. I'm not trained. You don't panic. You listen. You're quiet. Most cadets blab through pain like they're starring in their own holodrama. You sit with it. That counts for something. Later that day, he found himself assigned to assist with Rezik's therapy intake. The Gornii cadet was propped up on a recliner bed, third arm resting in a realignment brace, upper left shoulder immobilized in a pressure sling. The mottled color of his skin had shifted to a soft, neutral gray pain management and fatigue, if Jace remembered the reference charts correctly. Well, look who's come to finish the job, Rezik said hoarsely. Jace didn't smile. I didn't mean to hurt you. Yeah, I figured. Rezik exhaled slowly. You'd have taken my head if you had. There was a pause. Jace adjusted the sling with careful fingers. Don't touch the primary stabilizers, Rezik said, not unkindly. The pressure seals are automated. Jace nodded and sat back. Sorry. They stayed in silence while the room monitor pinged through the vitals. Most folks don't parry like that, Rezik finally said. You caught my strike like you knew where I was going. I did, Jace said. That's what I was trained to see. Rezik tilted his head. Earth combat styles. Didn't think humans were serious about melee. Jace shrugged. Most aren't. My uncle was. Rezik looked at him for a long moment. So, when do I learn that? Jace blinked. I mean it, Rezik said. The Sabers fun, but you moved like you were reading my muscles. That throw? I watched the footage. You didn't even lock your wrist. You shifted your weight, and I did the rest. It's not a technique you can learn in a day. I've got 6 weeks, Rezik muttered, gesturing at his shoulder. In the days that followed, Jace's quiet presence became something of a curiosity on campus. The footage of the duel had spread not officially, but cadets had ways. Someone had overlaid commentary, comparing Jace's stance to extinct Terran martial forms. Another video slowed down the moment of disarm, analyzing how the longsword's weight shifted the duel's rhythm entirely. Even Professor Vokthar had been spotted replaying the footage on a private holoslab after hours. Jace ignored it all. He reported to medbay, checked vitals, practiced shoulder mobility exercises with Rezik under supervision, and spent the rest of his free time in the simulation rooms without the longsword. That had been locked in secure storage bay Epsilon 12. He hadn't asked for it back. One evening, a Kadari student named Rena approached him outside a training room. She was humanoid but pale blue and long-limbed, her voice a soft trill. You're Jace, right? The sword human? He sighed. Just Jace. I was wondering, could you show me a stance? I've been trying to reverse engineer that sweep you did, but I think I'm holding wrong. Jace hesitated. I don't have a blade. Rena pulled out a stick, literally a carved wooden replica, roughly shaped like a longsword, bark still flaking off the handle. Jace gave a short laugh. That's not how we did it, but okay. He showed her the basic grounded stance, knees loose, weight low, blade angled from the hip. She was awkward at first, too upright, but eager. By the next day, 3 more cadets had joined her. One was Drillari, one had 6 legs. All had made rough wooden swords. Jace didn't start a class. He just showed up each night, and so did they. They mimicked what they saw. He corrected their balance, taught breathing, showed where their footing would fail. Always patient, never boastful. Back in the medbay, Rezik's recovery was going slowly but within expectations. Line checked the scans. Range is back to 80%. Full rotation in another 2 weeks if we stay ahead of scar tissue. Rezik flexed the arm and winced. Better than when it popped. Felt like a cold explosion. Jace glanced up from the interface. Do you want to keep working sword drills? I can slow it down. Rezik smirked. You're not getting rid of me that easy. The 2 of them moved to the auxiliary rehab room. Jace used 2 padded sticks from the storage unit and mimicked strikes slowly, letting Rezik adapt with one arm. Rezik grunted. You're doing it different now. Modified drills, Jace said. You can't use your third arm yet, so I'm adjusting for balance. You're teaching, Rezik realized. Like for real. Jace looked surprised. I guess so. Rezik rotated his wrist, just short of a full circle. You know this stuff better than our instructors know the training sabers. That's not true. Rezik leveled him a look. Jace, you're the only guy I've seen drop a weapon into a rotation just to force a shoulder misbalance. That's not instinct. That's doctrine. Jace didn't argue. Instead, he handed Rezik a stretch band. Let's focus on range today. You can't cut what you can't reach. Rezik muttered. You would turn therapy into a sparring lesson. But he didn't stop smiling. Toward the end of the 4th week, Jace was called to a debriefing room. Inside sat Vokthar and 2 other instructors, an Oshari with augmented optical ridges, and a human Arctari hybrid with tactical scars across her throat. Jace stood straight. Professor Vokthar regarded him. Your suspension from physical courses is lifted. The disciplinary review has concluded. Jace nodded. Understood. The Arctari leaned forward. Your records were unusual. You submitted training logs from New Kansas settlement. Some of the sessions were time-stamped at 5 in the morning. Yes, ma'am. My father and uncle believe discipline started before dawn. They weren't wrong, she said dryly. The Ashari instructor added, the footage of your duel has inspired significant curiosity. Several cadets have requested access to Earth blade forms. You've been informally demonstrating them. Without authorization. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Jace said. They asked. I just showed what I knew. Vakthar studied him. You misunderstand. We are not reprimanding you. Jace blinked. The Kraelian folded his arms. I still disagree with the use of lethal weapons in training, but I've reviewed your technique multiple times. What you brought was not reckless force, it was adapted structure. You demonstrated control, purpose, restraint. Jace hesitated. I dislocated Rezik's shoulder. And you took responsibility, Vakthar said, helped with recovery, earned respect. The Arctari passed over a data chip. We're revising the adaptive combat curriculum. You'll find a new elective, listed next semester. Analog melee forms, Earth variant. We would like your assistance in refining it. Jace stared at the chip. You don't have to say yes, she added, but it would be a waste not to ask. That night, Jace visited the storage bay for the first time in weeks. A guard verified his ID, then opened the secure drawer. Inside, wrapped in the same oilcloth, was the longsword. Jace unwrapped it slowly. The steel gleamed, unchanged. He didn't draw it, he just sat beside it on the bench, staring for a long while. Outside, on the practice fields, students were sparring under low lights. Some used standard sabers, others wielded wooden blades, rough cut, uneven. One of them bowed low in a stance Jace recognized. Earth taught. He didn't smile. But he did feel something like a nod from the past. A lesson living on. Jace hadn't been back on the main dueling floor since the day he'd laid Rezik flat and half the Academy's confidence in training sabers along with him. Now, standing at its edge again 5 weeks later, the familiar echo of boots on polished synthwood made his chest tighten. He hadn't brought the longsword. Not because he was afraid of what would happen, but because this wasn't about him anymore. The new elective, analog melee forms, Earth variant, wasn't listed under his name. Professor Vakthar had insisted it remain a joint faculty-led initiative. Jace wasn't officially an instructor, just a contributing practitioner, a source. Still, everyone in the class was staring at him. 24 cadets from 13 species had signed up. Some carried wooden replicas they'd carved themselves. Others had been issued polymer-weighted trainers based on Jace's measurements and his uncle's sword dimensions. They came in all sizes, with grips modified for species with clawed hands, webbed digits, and even tentacle bundles. At least 5 of them were better athletes than him. 2 were tacticians in every other field, but none of them moved like they believed the weapon was real. Jace stepped onto the floor. His movements were deliberate, measured, every step echoed. Show me your stances, he said. They complied, clumsy and uncertain. One Veltiri cadet stood so rigidly upright that her knees shook. No weight forward, knees loose. The ground isn't a formality, it's your anchor. Jace walked among them, adjusting shoulders, tapping hips, nudging elbows. This isn't a dance, it's not for points, this is a conversation. Your blade speaks, make sure it's saying what you mean. He didn't demonstrate much, he just corrected, observed, let them fail and feel it. By the end of the hour, they were soaked in sweat and frustration. Jace waited for the first complaint. None came. Rena approached, panting. You always train this hard? Jace shrugged. On Earth, we trained like our lives might depend on it, because sometimes they did. That quieted the room. The following week, Jace found himself in an unexpected position. He was now being invited, not ordered, invited to observe other combat classes. Not for disciplinary reasons, not because he was under review, but because instructors wanted to know what he thought. Professor Calwin, a meticulous strategy specialist from the Oort Belt colonies, asked him to comment on a simulation involving a corridor ambush. These students opted for plasma throwers and cover fire. You'd have used the sword? No, Jace said, not unless I had to. The sword's not for charging, it's for when everything else fails. Or when you want the other side to feel the danger personally? Colwyn had blinked. Feel the danger? Jace nodded. Plasma's fast, impersonal, cold. A blade is close, intentional. The second someone sees you choose it, they know you've accepted being within reach. That changes the psychology of a fight. The professor didn't interrupt again. Another instructor invited Jace to an equipment calibration session. The academy was experimenting with shock-absorbing mesh woven into gloves and gauntlets, trying to make analog weapons safer for interspecies use. Jace tested a prototype grip that simulated real steel weight, but with dampened feedback. It's close, he said, but if you dull the feedback too much, they'll forget it's a weapon. Might as well hand them broomsticks. The engineer just nodded and scribbled furiously. Word was spreading. Meanwhile, Rezek was cleared for full-duty use of his shoulder after 6.5 weeks. The medics had performed a final motion scan and declared 98% mobility with negligible scar tissue interference. He celebrated by tossing a polymer longsword at Jace the moment he walked into the rec yard. Catch. Jace did. The balance was off, slightly tip-heavy. Custom weight, Rezek said. Tuned it to match my reach. Jace raised a brow. You planning to challenge someone? Maybe, Rezek grinned. Or maybe I just want to see if you're still fast without a steel ego in your hands. The match was short, but not easy. Rezek had learned. He still wasn't trained in the old forms, he didn't move like Jace, but he'd absorbed the underlying lessons. When to shift weight, how to feint, when to use momentum. Jace had to genuinely adjust. And when Rezek finally lost, it wasn't because he made a mistake. It was because Jace didn't. They both sat down afterward, sweating and laughing. The kind of laughter that came from mutual exhaustion, not mockery. Still hate me for dislocating your shoulder? Jace asked. Rezek flexed the arm and winced. Remind me in 10 years when the arthritis kicks in. Jace looked genuinely concerned. That might actually happen. Good, Rezek said. Then I'll get to blame you and get out of field duty early. Later that week, Professor Vakthar called Jace into his office. It was a large, domed space with alien scrolls mounted in hexagonal frames and a massive desk that looked grown from petrified roots. The Craelian was pacing slowly, a stylus clutched in one clawed hand. I reviewed your recommendations on the new sword protocol, he said without preamble. I've made adjustments. Jace waited. We'll issue standardized wooden analogs next semester for cadets requesting analog melee electives. The weights will vary by species. Safety protocols will be enforced but minimal padding. We'll emphasize form and intent, not performance metrics. Jace nodded slowly. That sounds right. Vakthar turned to him. You are not an instructor. You are not faculty. You are not formally qualified to shape combat curriculum. Jace stood straighter. Understood. And yet, Vakthar added, you've reshaped how 20% of our cadets view weapon training, without formal authority, without seeking recognition. Jace didn't answer. The Craelian's voice lowered. I am considering proposing a formal mentorship title for you. Not instructor, not adjunct. Something new. Something that reflects your contribution without distorting the hierarchy. Jace hesitated. You don't have to. I do, Vakthar said. Because the sword is not the only teacher, neither are we. Sometimes, discipline walks in wearing an oilcloth bundle and a haunted look in its eyes. Jace blinked. I don't think I'm ready for a title. Good, Vakthar rumbled. That's what tells me you are. It took another 2 weeks before Jace visited the secure storage bay again. He didn't need the longsword. He just wanted to see it. The guard handed it over without a word. Jace unwrapped it slowly and laid it across the bench. The blade still bore the scratches from years of sparring. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't ceremonial. It was a tool, purposeful. There was a small note folded into the canvas this time. A printout, standard font, forged through. It wasn't his handwriting. It wasn't his uncle's. It was Professor Vokthar's signature at the bottom. Jace didn't smile, but he did sit beside the blade for a long time. Across the campus, in simulation rooms and echoing training halls, cadets were moving through stances from a planet many of them had never seen. They tripped, they stumbled, they swore, but they were learning. And the blade now wood, now polymer, but once steel was still teaching. By the end of the semester, the analog blade elective had a waitlist. Not because it was mandatory, far from it, but because cadets had begun to talk about what it meant to train with something that didn't buzz, beep, or autocorrect your grip. They talked about balance, about weight, about the moment, when everything else, species, origin, even tech faded, and it was just you and your stance. It had become less about Earth and more about focus. Jace, for his part, never stood at the front of the room. Not once. He always assisted from the edge, stepping in to correct posture, explain a historical variant, or demonstrate a move if someone was stuck. He didn't wear an instructor's patch. He wasn't listed on the course materials, but when someone lost their footing or overcommitted a swing, they always looked to him. By now, even the alien cadets who hadn't taken the elective referred to him by a quiet nickname, Steel. Not a title, a reference. Jace hadn't heard it used in front of him until the day of the interdepartmental sparring exhibition. It wasn't a competition, not officially. Just an annual show of progress and cooperation between species, a full day of duels, tactical demos, and simulated engagements. Normally, it was all saber work. Blunted plasma blades, ultralight pulse batons, and carbon foam staves. This year, a new exhibition had been added near the end of the day. Cross-disciplinary analog melee cultural demonstration. Jace didn't volunteer. He hadn't even signed up. But when the duelists were announced over the comms, his name was called anyway, alongside Rezik. He stood behind the staging barrier for nearly 2 minutes, debating whether to step onto the floor. His chest felt tight, not from fear, from pressure. The duel hadn't been his idea. But neither had the first one. Rezik appeared at his side, fully suited, a composite longsword in his left hand, right hand flexing loosely. "You gonna make me fight a ghost?" Jace glanced at him. "They're expecting something flashy," Rezik continued. "We could just stand there and bow a lot. Maybe fall over dramatically. I'm sure the Gornai diplomats would love that." Jace exhaled and adjusted his tunic. "You're cleared for full contact?" Med team's already cranky about it. Said I'm still technically 2 weeks early for full rotational stress. I said, if I pop the joint again, I'm blaming you and calling it a cultural bond injury. Jace gave him a sideways glance. "You're ridiculous." "And yet, you showed up." The signal tone sounded. They stepped into the arena. The demonstration wasn't scored. It wasn't timed. The only goal was to show what had been learned: technique, control, form. The arena was packed. Jace took his stance grounded, familiar, angled low. Rezik mirrored it, not perfectly, but close. His third arm hung loose, unused but present. Their first exchange was slow, deliberate. Jace tested his opponent's range. Rezik responded with a diagonal parry and foot pivot moves. Jace hadn't taught, but that he recognized. Adapted, personalized. The rhythm built. Strike, step, counter. Rezik lunged. Jace sidestepped, redirecting the motion instead of stopping it. They moved across the floor like two rivers clashing at the edge. Every movement was real. Not lethal, but real. No energy field buzzed to life. No safeties auto-corrected a bad move. There was only the sound of polymer blades clacking, boots shifting, and breath timing. Then it happened. Rezik rotated his torso for a feint, a move Jace had seen him practice 100 times. But something in his footwork misaligned. Jace saw the shift. In that instant, he knew exactly how to finish it. Redirect the blade, step behind, shoulder lock. He'd done it before. But he didn't. Instead, he let the momentum pass. He disengaged, reset. Rezik recovered with a look that said he'd noticed too. The match ended with a mutual halt gesture. No one had fallen. No one had disarmed the other. And yet, the applause that followed echoed longer than any previous duel. They bowed. Properly. And walked off the floor together. Afterward, Jace sat alone at the top of the observation deck, above the main training field. His longsword lay beside him, wrapped again in its oilcloth. He didn't carry it much these days. But he still kept it clean. Professor Vakthar approached slowly and stood beside him. The Kraelian said nothing for a moment. Then, "That wasn't the finish I expected." Jace shrugged. "It wasn't mine to finish." Vakthar grunted. "Mercy? No respect." The professor turned his head slightly. "You passed on the opening." "I chose to. That was the lesson." Vakthar let out a low breath. "Not quite agreement. Not quite disapproval. "I've seen 1,000 cadets show dominance with a blade," he said. "Fewer than 10 ever demonstrated choice." Jace looked down at the field. Sometimes not taking the strike is the most important form. The Craelian said nothing, but when he left, there was something almost reverent in the silence he left behind. The next day, Jace received a small package in his dorm. No note, no sender listed. Inside was a handcrafted wooden replica of his uncle's longsword, carved from polished driftwood, sanded smooth. On the hilt, etched with a fine tool, were the words, "For the ones who choose when not to cut." He placed it upright in the corner of his room. He never asked who sent it. But later, in the elective class, he noticed Rena had a new blade balanced, clearly modeled on the same template. Her footing was better, her strikes tighter. They were growing, all of them, and none of it had come from a data chip or a neural upload. It had come from mistakes, from weight, from hesitation, from impact, from steel. At the end of the term, Jace visited the storage bay one last time. He retrieved the longsword, signed the exit log, and carried it unwrapped across campus as the sky shifted into the pale violet dusk of Elion 6. He didn't take it to class. He didn't bring it into any demonstrations. He took it outside the walls, to the training fields beyond the main dome, where no gravity dampeners flattened the ground and no hover cameras followed cadets. The grass was uneven, the wind sharp, real. He planted the sword tip first into the soil, knelt beside it, and sat for a long time. He wasn't mourning. He wasn't celebrating. He was remembering. Steel wasn't about winning. It was about standing where others fell, choosing clarity over pride, choosing not to strike when you could. And that, Jace finally understood, was why his uncle had trained him the way he did, not to make him a killer, but to make him someone who would always think before becoming one. When he rose again, he cleaned the blade with a cloth from his coat and rewrapped it. Then he walked back into the academy. And behind him, on a quiet hill just beyond the compound wall, a single deep blade point marked the earth. A reminder that sometimes the blade wasn't the weapon. It was the mirror.